Welcome to another Stopping Socialism video. I'm Donald Kendal, joined, as always, by Justin Haskins. So, Justin, in this kind of crazy time that we're living in, it seems like there's a lot of young people that are thinking that the only way to get their rights granted to them is by pursuing like a Marxist ideology. So, I'm looking through the old Soviet Union Constitution here. And it seems like they grant a lot of rights to people, including freedom of association and speech, as well as a number of other things, including healthcare and education. So maybe they're not wrong. Maybe we can have a Soviet country, socialist country that protects rights.
You know, I think it's what's really interesting. Nobody actually reads the Soviet Constitution, except for losers like you. Why would anybody read the Soviet Constitution, right? That's sort of the interesting... It's obviously most people would think this is, boring. Soviet Union doesn't even exist anymore. What does it matter, right? Most people don't even know our own constitution, never mind the Soviet Constitution. But the thing that I like about the Soviet Constitution, the thing I find really interesting about it, is that the Soviet Union wrote this constitution relatively early on in its history, the first version of it. And so it represents a sort of idealistic vision for what they imagined their society would be and what they wanted. And it was a little bit more rights oriented and things like that than you might get later on after the Soviet Union's been around for 50 years and they're just trying to survive and dominate the world and all that good stuff, beat Rocky Balboa and everything. So what I think, what's really interesting is that it's full of left-wing socialist ideology. And it actually sounds very much like the platform of Bernie Sanders. I mean, if I took parts, in fact, maybe we should do this. If I took parts of the Soviet Constitution and I just read it to people and I told them that it was the, platform of a politician that's popular today, I guarantee you that most people would say Bernie Sanders. Like, I guarantee it, because it sounds exactly like it. It guarantees all kinds of rights, not just to goods and services and things like healthcare and whatever, but also it promises religious liberty. It promises equality among the sexes. It promises the bans to all kinds of exploitive worker things, like I think child labor is in here somewhere, if I remember right. So there's all sorts of things in there that you look at, and when it's talking about freedom of religion and freedom of culture and all these different things, you think, well, what's wrong with this? How is it that a country that could build all of this into their constitution? Because here in the United States, we talk about our constitution all the time, conservatives more than any other group, about how important the Constitution is for protecting our liberties. But then you have all these liberties in the Soviet Constitution protected, and yet we know from history that they went on to abuse people nonstop. In fact, they were abusing people when they wrote this Constitution.
Yeah,
okay,
right. Like gulags. They were like humongous human rights violators. Like, how does all that stuff happen in a country where they have all of these rights protected?
Exactly. It makes no sense. And they were doing it actually before they even wrote this Constitution, because the Constitution that we're reading from, I think is from the 1930s. The Soviet Union was around before that. So they were already abusing people's rights when they wrote these things. And then they abused people's rights going forward after this Constitution too. So how is this possible? It's possible because of this. You can promise people all the rights you want, but as individuals, and say you have all these individual rights. But if you also say that the collective has rights that supersede the rights of the individual, then whatever rights you give the individual ultimately don't matter. Okay? And that's exactly what Bernie Sanders believes in. That's exactly what the Soviet Constitution argues. So other parts of the Soviet Constitution, sometimes right up next to parts that talk about individual rights, also talk about these collective ideas, these collective rights. So this comes from Chapter 7 of the Soviet Constitution, Article 39, and I'm going to read it in full. It's not very long. It says, citizens of the USSR, that's the Soviet Union, enjoy in full the social, economic, political, and personal rights and freedoms proclaimed and guaranteed by the Constitution of the USSR and by Soviet laws. Okay, sounds good so far. The socialist system ensures enlargement of the rights and freedoms of citizens and continuous improvement of their living standards as social, economic, and cultural development programs are fulfilled. But then it says this. This is the most important sentence in the Soviet Constitution. It explains every terrible thing that has ever happened in the history of the Soviet Union. Enjoyment by citizens of their rights. So they have these rights. Enjoyment by citizens of their rights, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, all those things, and freedoms, must not be to the detriment of the interests of society or the state, or infringe the rights of other citizens. Okay.
A giant asterisk after your
giant asterisk. Right, exactly. So here you have all these rights are listed. There's tons of them. We didn't even read them all off, but there's tons and tons of rights listed before and after this part. But then you get enjoyment by citizens of their rights and freedoms must not be to the detriment of the interest of society or the state. So now you have rights, sure, but so long as they don't get in the way of the interests of society or the state. Yeah. That's exactly what every left-wing person believes. Yeah. You have rights, but your individual rights are not as important as the rights of the collective. Stop being such a selfish, greedy person. You have rights to a house, to property, to business, to religion, to all these things, of course, but not if it gets in the way in what's good for the collective, because if that happens, now you don't really have those rights anymore. They disappear because the collective is always more important than the individual.
Yeah, and you can see how that applies to pretty much anything that you can cherish about the actual freedoms that we have in this country. If you have the freedom of speech, okay? But certain speech might be construed as a detriment to society or some other, group of people. So now you can't actually say anything bad about the government, because that could be to the detriment of the country itself. So that's not included in this. That's not included in your freedom of speech. And you can just apply that logic to everything, freedom of association. Okay, but you're hanging out with people and the ideas that you're talking about, again, might be to the detriment of the country or society or the collective in general. So no, that association, that's not allowed. So it's just like, they might as well not even put these in here. Like, that just undercuts everything. It's ridiculous.
Exactly. Well, it's exactly right. And the other thing to remember, because you might be watching this and thinking, well, all right, well, that was the Soviet Union. We don't have that asterisk in our Constitution.
Sure.
That's right. Yeah, you're darn right. We don't have that asterisk in our Constitution. That's why we actually have individual rights in America. That's why America has lasted a much longer than the Soviet Union lasted. It's why we haven't seen the same level of atrocities. As bad as things have been at certain points in the history of this country, nothing compares to the Soviet Union in the history of this country. Literally nothing. What the Soviet Union did to its own people was absolutely atrocious. And they did it all while saying, yeah, you've got freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and freedom of religion and all of this. They had one party rule, essentially. But they said that they had political freedoms. They had crackdowns on religious leaders. They threw priests and other religious leaders in prison. They outlawed religious beliefs all the time, but they said you had freedom of religion. Now you might be thinking, okay, well, what does that have to do with me though in America? I don't have to worry about this. Well, in addition to the Bernie Sanders crowd and all of that believing in this, just even your run-of-the-mill progressive, even your run-of-the-mill liberal also believes in this same thing, even though they don't necessarily say it. If you take their logical ideas, if you take their ideas to the logical end, it's the same exact result. And in some cases, we've actually seen them do this. The best example that I think the most well-known example, and it's a really easy to understand example, was under the Affordable Care Act. Okay, Barack Obama, Democrat-run Congress, rammed through the Affordable Care Act. This creates Obamacare, right? Part of Obamacare was this provision that mandated that employers, nonprofits, others, provide their employees, their female employees, with contraception. Oh my gosh, looks like something just fell off your wall. Part of the Affordable Care Act, they guaranteed contraception coverage. So your employers had to provide contraception for their employees. So for example, birth control pills were a big part of this, right? But there are all these employers who believe that it's immoral to provide people with contraception. In particular, nuns, right? Roman Catholics, devout Roman Catholics. All devout Roman Catholics, according to official teaching from the Roman Catholic Church, are supposed to avoid contraception. All right. So if you're a nun, it's part of your religious beliefs to not have contraception and to not give other people contraception. You think it's wrong, not just birth control pills, but any form of contraception. You're not supposed to have it. And yet this law was mandating that these people provide contraception to their employees, even though it violated their religious beliefs. So here on the one hand, they're saying, yeah, you guys have religious beliefs. You can practice your religion all you want, but not if it gets in the way of contraception coverage for your female employees, because the collective good of providing people with contraception outweighs your religious objection. That's the fundamental concept that existed. So these nuns sued and they went to court and they've been fighting this legal battle for years and years and years. And they've actually won in the Supreme Court multiple times, including very recently they won in the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled, no, actually, you can't force individuals to pay for something if there's a legitimate religious belief that would be violated as a result of this happening. So you can't force people to violate their religious beliefs in order to conduct business. You have to come up with some kind of accommodation that allows them to get around that. All right. Now, why did they say that? Because in our Constitution, we don't have a little asterisk that says you have freedom of religion. Government can't stop you from worshiping freely your religious beliefs, unless, of course, it gets in the way of the good of the society or the state. Well, then they can't do it. We don't have that asterisk. So the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the nuns. All right. But in the Soviet Union and in the minds of the left, that asterisk should exist. It's an important asterisk to have. It's essential and necessary for modern societies. And although our Supreme Court ruled to protect those rights, not every member of the Supreme Court ruled in that direction. The liberal members of the Supreme Court said, no, your religious exemption, we don't care what the plain language of the Constitution says. We don't believe that your religious beliefs should exempt you from having to provide people with contraception. Even though the Constitution seems to protect that from happening, that's not what those Supreme Court justices believed. So throughout the left, even many moderates, even, not everyone who voted for Obamacare was a far left-wing socialist Democratic congressperson, right? A lot of them were considered somewhat moderate, and yet even they were willing to vote for something like that. Why? Because at the end of the day, whenever you put collectivism first, it means, by definition, the rights of the individual have to be limited. And that's the danger of all collectivist systems, whether it's just a little bit of liberalism, progressivism, socialism, full-blown Marxist communism, it doesn't matter. The rights of the individual always have to take a backseat to what's in the best interests of the collective. And of course, how do we even know that whatever that law is or program is really in the best interest of the collective? Who gets to decide that? Well, the collective gets to decide that, or the people that they appoint gets to decide that. So ultimately it means anything. And that's how you end up with the Soviet Union turning into a nightmare state, because whatever the ruling class decided was in the best interest of the collective became the rule of law. I mean, it became the law of the land, and everything else, all these individual rights that they promised, that took a backseat.
Yeah, I mean, like, you could see this with proposed, hate speech laws, or hate speech laws that do exist in places like Canada or the UK or a whole number of European countries, where, you can have their freedom of speech, kind of, but it's not directly stated like it is in the American Constitution. So it kind of takes a backseat to all these except fors. And you see people going to jail for making seemingly harmless comments on like Facebook and social media. So yeah, it's a short hop, skip, and a jump away from what we saw in the Soviet Union.
Yeah, and speaking of that, we should probably do a video just on this topic alone. But we were just talking about this the other day, not on the air. In France and in Germany, they now have laws that require Facebook and other social media companies to remove content that they say has is like a form of hate speech. They have laws that say that they must do this within 24 hours or else they will receive these massive $1 million fines, in some cases multi-million-dollar fines. All right. Now, those countries also have constitutions that promise freedom of speech. They do.
Right.
But so you have the right to freedom of speech in Germany and France, but not if it's hate speech. If it's hate speech, then we're going to silence it. Or, well, maybe you have the right to do it in your own home by yourself, but not on a social media platform. You don't have the right to do that. And any company that lets you do that, we're going to fine them. That's how they define freedom of speech. So freedom of speech exists in some version of it, but not if it gets in the way of the collective interest, which is we don't want a society where people are, spreading fake news and saying things that offend people. Well, you don't have a right to do that. So this is a real thing that exists in the West. This is not some crazy thing that, only existed in the Soviet Union and in Mao's China or something. This exists today. It exists in Western countries today, but it's really well exemplified by the Soviet Union's constitution, which is why we're talking about it, because they so plainly state it.
Right.
And that's why I love it so much. It's just the perfect little, yup, all these things, you're free, you're free, you're free. Well, here's the asterisk. And it's so perfect for that reason.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, we're going to continue to follow stories like this and discuss topics like this on our Stopping Socialism channels. You can find our content at stoppingsocialism.com, on Facebook, Stopping Socialism. You can also find more videos like this on YouTube, Stopping Socialism TV. And we also have an Instagram account and a new Parler account, so you can check us out, follow us there. Justin, where can the people find you?
On socialist Twitter at Justin T. Haskins.
Absolute cesspool. Thank you all. We'll talk to you later.